What would you do if a will was read out in a drawing room, and the old woman who wrote it had left her entire estate not to either of her sons, but to the housemaid standing at the back of the room with her hands folded? For Prudence Attwell, 25 years old, in service since she was 13, it was the most frightening moment of her life. Not the best, the most frightening. Because she knew, standing there with 40 pairs of eyes turning slowly toward her, exactly what she had inherited: a manor called Harrowgate with 110 years of neglect in it, 2 furious sons who would fight her for it, and a village that would never in 1,000 years forgive a servant for stepping over her station. And she also knew something else. She knew what was in the north cellar, because she was the only living person who had ever been shown it, on a wet evening in March, by an old woman who had already decided how this was going to go, and had never once mentioned it to her lawyer. Settle in and let us travel back to the low green hills of 1880s Shropshire, to a story about a house, 2 furious sons, and a promise made between 2 women that nobody else heard. To understand what the old lady did, you have to understand the 2 of them, and the 11 years they spent alone together in a house too big for either of them. Augusta Harrowgate was 81 when she died, and she had outlived her husband by 32 years and her only daughter by 19. She was not a sweet old woman. Nobody who knew her ever used that word. She was tall and dry and abrupt. She had been an intelligent girl married at 19 to a heavy squire who thought reading made women unwell, and she had spent 60 years in a house where nobody once asked her opinion about anything that mattered. By the end of her life, she had the reputation in 3 parishes of being difficult, which in that county meant a woman who said what she thought at a volume other people could hear. Prudence Attwell came to Harrowgate in 1868 as the second housemaid, aged 13, from a cottage in the village where she was one of 7. She was quick, she was silent, and she had one peculiarity that the housekeeper marked with disapproval and that changed the whole course of her life: she could read, and did wherever she found anything to read, including on the stairs, including when she was supposed to be carrying coal. The old lady caught her at it in the winter of 1869, sitting on the back stairs with a coal scuttle beside her and a volume of somebody's sermons open on her knees. And Augusta Harrowgate, who by then had not had a conversation with an intelligent person in 11 years, did not dismiss her. She inquired what the girl made of it. Prudence, terrified, gave it as her opinion that the man who wrote it had never been hungry, and the old lady laughed, for the first time in a considerable while, and bade her put the coal down and come to the library. That was the beginning of 11 years. Not a friendship, exactly. The gap between them was too wide, and both of them knew the shape of it too well. But the household ran down, as households do, and the staff went one by one as the money tightened. And by 1876 there was a cook, a man for the garden and the horse, and Prudence, who had risen without anybody formally deciding it into being maid, companion, nurse, secretary, and, in every way that mattered, the person who ran Harrowgate. She read aloud in the evenings. She wrote the letters when the old lady's hands went. She learned the house the way you learn a person you nurse: which floorboards, which chimneys, which windows, where the water came in, and the sons. Reginald Harrowgate was 52, the elder, and he had a wine business in Bristol that had been going to come right for 20 years. Clement was 48 and had a wife with expectations and a house in Cheltenham he could not afford. Neither of them had lived at Harrowgate since they were boys. They came at Christmas, usually, and they came whenever there was a question of money, which was more often. Their mother received them and fed them and lent them what she could, and after they had gone, she would sit for a long time in the window of the long parlour without saying anything at all. They were not monsters. That is worth saying plainly. They were 2 ordinary middle-aged men who had been raised to believe that a house is a sum of money that has not yet been realized, and who had between them, over 11 years, not once written to their mother except to ask for something. In the last 4 years of her life, when she was mostly in her chair and then mostly in her bed, Reginald came twice and Clement 3 times, and every visit concerned the estate. Neither of them was in the house when she died. Prudence was. What Prudence also was, though nobody in the county knew it, was the only person Augusta Harrowgate ever showed the north cellar. It happened in the March of 1879, a year and a half before the end. The old lady had been strange all that day, restless, and in the evening she made Prudence fetch a lamp and help her down the back stairs, which was a considerable business by then, and along the stone passage under the north wing to a door that Prudence had assumed for 11 years was a coal store. It was not locked. It had simply never been opened, because the housekeeper's keys had been reorganized in 1861, and the door had gone off the list, and a door that is not on the list in a house of 40 rooms may as well not exist. Inside was a low vaulted room, dry, thick with dust, and it held 2 things. The first was furniture, not fine furniture, but the plain oak furniture of a much older house. Tables and settles and a great carved bed frame, put down there in 1811 when Augusta's father-in-law rebuilt the front of Harrowgate in the fashionable style and cleared out everything old. The second was a stack of black japanned deed boxes, 11 of them, and a court cupboard full of papers, and in it, as Augusta Harrowgate showed her that evening by lamplight, with her hand shaking on Prudence's arm, the entire muniments of the estate, the manorial rolls, the enclosure awards, 300 years of leases, and the deeds. Before we go on, let us know in the comments whether you think the old lady was right to do what she did, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage and hidden worth. And the old lady, sitting down on a dust-sheeted settle because she could not stand any longer, told Prudence Attwell the thing she had come down to tell her, which was that her husband's family had sold off the Harrowgate land in 6 separate parcels between 1848 and 1861 to pay for the boys' schooling and a series of catastrophic investments, and that in every one of those 6 conveyances the family solicitor of the day had drawn the boundary from the tithe map and not from the manorial rolls, because the manorial rolls were in a cellar that was not on the list, and that the difference between the two, in the case of the strip along the Cleobury road, was 91 acres. Then she extracted a promise that Prudence would tell nobody. Not the lawyer, not the sons. And Prudence, who was 24 and had been in service since she was 13 and had no idea what any of it meant, gave her word, because that was what one did. Augusta Harrowgate died on a Tuesday in the October of 1880, in her own bed, holding Prudence Attwell's hand, and her last coherent instruction to the woman who had nursed her for 4 years concerned the gray shawl, which Prudence took to mean the gray shawl. The will was read on the Friday in the long parlour by a Shrewsbury solicitor named Mr. Sowerby, before both sons' wives, a cousin, the doctor, the rector, and, standing at the back by the door in her black dress as was proper, the staff, the cook, the outdoor man, and Prudence. It was a short will, and it had been drawn 11 months before. It gave £200 each to Reginald and Clement Harrowgate, being, in the will's own words, in addition to the sums advanced to them in my lifetime, which they have not repaid, and which I do not require them to repay. It gave £50 to the cook and 30 to the outdoor man. And it gave the manor house of Harrowgate its contents, its offices and the 11 acres remaining to it, absolutely and without condition, to Prudence Mary Attwell, in gratitude for 11 years of intelligent company, which is a thing I did not expect to receive in this house. Mr. Sowerby read it in a flat voice, and then took his spectacles off. Nobody said anything for what Prudence afterwards judged to be about 4 seconds, and then Clement Harrowgate laughed, one loud disbelieving bark of a laugh, and his wife pronounced the word servant in a tone that Prudence had heard perhaps 1,000 times in 12 years, and had never once heard aimed at her from that distance. And then the whole room turned around and looked at her. She did not faint, and she did not weep, and she did not say a word. She stood with her back against the doorframe and her hands folded in front of her, exactly as she had been trained to stand at the age of 13, and she looked at the far window and waited for it to stop, and that image, the maid in black standing perfectly still in the doorway, while 40 years of a family's expectations came apart in front of her, was the thing the county talked about for the next 10 years. Reginald Harrowgate came to her that same evening, alone, and was, in his way, reasonable. He found her in the kitchen passage, and he did not raise his voice. He did not blame her, by his own account. A young woman in her position could hardly have been expected to refuse. His mother had not been herself, and the sensible course, the course that would spare everybody a great deal of unpleasantness, was for Miss Attwell to renounce quietly, in which case the family would see her generously provided for, and would say nothing whatever about how the will had come to be made. He stood delivering all this in a passage he had not walked down since he was 9 years old, and he did not know that the door at the end of it led to the north cellar, and he did not know that the woman he was speaking to had been down there with a lamp and knew what was in the fourth box. She would think about it. It was the only untrue thing she uttered to anybody in the whole of that year. The sons filed a caveat within 11 days. Their case was not, in fact, absurd, and it is worth understanding it because Prudence had to understand it. They pleaded undue influence, that a woman of 80 had been isolated in a decaying house with a servant 30 years her junior who read to her, wrote for her, controlled who came in and out, and who had, at the crucial time, been the only person present. They produced a housekeeper dismissed in 1875 who was prepared to swear the girl had always been sly. They produced the fact, which was true, that the will had been drawn during a period when the old lady was largely bedridden, and they had the enormous silent weight of everybody's instinct on their side, because in Shropshire in 1880 the proposition that a housemaid had honestly earned a manor house was not an argument, it was a joke. The village turned. That is the part Prudence had not been ready for. She had expected the family to fight. She had not expected the cottage she had grown up in to go quiet when she walked past it, or her own sister to stop her in the lane and inform her that people were saying things and that she had brought it on herself. The cook gave notice in the November and would not look at her. By December, the only 2 people in the world who would take Prudence Attwell's part were the outdoor man, Josiah Ballard, who was 68 and stayed on for no wages through that winter because, in his own phrase, he had promised the mistress he would see to the horse, and a Shrewsbury solicitor's clerk who wrote her a very careful letter she could not afford to act on. She spent that winter alone in 40 rooms with the caveat hanging over her, unable to sell anything, unable to spend anything, living in the still room with 2 fires worth of wood and the cook's abandoned copper. She was 25 years old. She had a house she could not use, an income of nothing, a village that had decided about her, and a promise to a dead woman that she had begun, by February, to understand was the only thing she actually owned. It is worth saying plainly what that winter was, because the county's version of it afterwards was that the maid had come into a fortune, and the truth was almost exactly the reverse. A house under caveat is a house nobody may touch. She could not sell a chair, or fell a tree, or let a field, or borrow a shilling against 40 rooms, because until the court said whose the house was, it was legally nobody's. So Prudence Attwell owned a manor and lived, that winter, more poorly than she had lived as a servant in it, because as a servant she had at least been fed. She moved into the still room and shut the rest of the house, and shut it properly the way she had been taught to shut rooms in October, sashes fastened, chimneys stopped with sacking against the jackdaws, dust sheets over everything, shutters barred, and a walk through the whole of it once a week with a lamp to look for water. That weekly walk was the strangest hour of her life. 40 rooms under white cloth, her own footsteps behind her in the dust, and the knowledge that every stick of it might be taken off her in the spring by 2 men who had not written to their mother in 11 years. She ate what the kitchen garden had gone to and what Ballard shot, and she washed at the scullery pump, and in January the pump froze for 9 days, and she carried water from the horse trough. Her hands cracked. Her shoes went. She had one candle a night and made it last by sitting close to the fire to read, exactly as she had at 13 on the back stairs with a coal scuttle beside her, which struck her one evening as so nearly funny that she laughed out loud in an empty house and then found she could not stop for some time. What she did not do was write to anybody, or go down to the village, or answer the 2 letters from Clement Harrowgate's wife, the first of which was pitying and the second of which was not. And she did not, in all those months, once go down to the north cellar. Because she had told nobody about the north cellar. Not Mr. Sowerby, who was her own solicitor now, and who had asked her repeatedly, and with some exasperation, whether there was anything at all she had not told him. Not the clerk. Not Ballard. She had promised, and it had not occurred to her, in the first 4 months, that a promise made in a cellar could be anything other than a burden. There is a thing that happens to a person who keeps a large empty house alive alone, and it happened to Prudence Attwell that winter. She began to know Harrowgate the way you know a body you have nursed. She knew that the chimney in the blue bedroom drew badly in a north wind, and would smoke the room out by morning if the sacking slipped. She knew the crack over the library door was an old settlement crack that had finished moving before she was born, and the one on the north landing was not, and she watched it through the frosts with a pencil mark and a date. She knew which sashes had swelled and which had shrunk. Twice that January she was up on a chair at 2 in the morning with a bucket and a wad of rag, catching water off a slipped slate in the passage above the still room, and both times she noted the position and the date in the back of a household book. In the hand she had learned copying letters for a woman whose fingers had gone. It was not devotion, exactly. She would have said, if anyone had asked, that she was simply looking after something that had been left in her charge, which was the only kind of relationship to a house she had ever been permitted to have. But it meant that when the spring came, Prudence Attwell knew more about the actual condition of the Manor of Harrowgate than every solicitor, valuer, and Harrowgate's son involved in the dispute put together, and rather more than the old lady herself had known at the end. What changed her mind was the letter of the 14th of March, in which Reginald Harrowgate's solicitors offered, without prejudice, to withdraw the caveat if Miss Attwell would convey the house to the family and accept the sum of £150 and a written character, and observed that Miss Attwell might wish to consider that litigation of this kind commonly consumed rather more than the value of the property in dispute, and that a person in her position had, realistically, no means of sustaining it. Prudence Attwell read that letter twice. Then she went and got the lamp. She spent 9 days in the north cellar. She did not know what she was looking for, because she was a housemaid who could read, not a lawyer, and the manorial rolls of Harrowgate were in Latin and in a court hand of the 17th century that she could make almost nothing of. But she had been the woman who wrote Augusta Harrowgate's letters for 4 years, and she knew what a deed looked like. And she knew what the old lady had told her on the settle: 6 conveyances, 1848 to 1861, and a strip along the Cleobury road. She found the 6 conveyances in the 4th deed box. She found the tithe map. And then, because she had learned patience carrying coal, she found the thing that mattered, which was not in a box at all, but rolled in the court cupboard in a linen sleeve, the estate map of 1799, drawn by a surveyor for the Harrowgate family before any of it was sold, showing the manor's boundary running not along the Cleobury road, but along the old hedge and ditch 91 acres to the west. Of it, exactly as the manorial rolls recorded, exactly as the tithe map of 1841 did not. And with it, folded, in a hand she knew as well as her own because she had spent 4 years copying it out for a woman whose fingers had gone. A letter. My dear Prudence, the old lady had written, in the November of 1879, 4 months after the cellar and 7 months before she took to her bed for the last time. If you are reading this, you have opened the boxes, which means either that I am dead, and you have kept your promise until it became foolish to keep it, or that you are less obedient than I supposed, and I should be glad of either. I have thought a long time about what I am doing to you, and I want you to know that I know what it is. I am not making you a gift. I am handing you a fight. You are 24, and you have no money and no family behind you and no standing. And I am about to put you in a position where 2 men with lawyers will try to break you in public, and where the people you grew up among will very likely side with them, because it is easier to believe a servant is sly than to believe an old woman meant what she said. I have thought about this, and I am doing it anyway, and here is my reasoning, and you may judge it. I have watched my sons wait for me to die for 20 years. I do not hate them. I made them, or their father did, and they are what this kind of house makes of men who are told from the cradle that a place is owed to them. If I leave Harrowgate to Reginald, it is sold within 2 years to pay for the wine business, and I know it. If I leave it to Clement, it is sold within 1. Either way the house is broken up, the contents are auctioned in the stable yard, and the whole thing goes for whatever it fetches in a bad market to somebody who will strip the lead. I have seen it done at Fenner's Hof and at Barton Court, and I will not have it here. You are the only person I have met in 30 years who is interested in this house rather than in what it is worth. That is the whole of my reason. It is not sentiment. It is the same reason a sensible farmer chooses the man who understands the land over the son who wants the money. Now, the cellar. Everything I told you in March is true, and the proof of it is in the box with this letter. 91 acres along the Cleobury Road were conveyed in 1856 on a boundary taken from the tithe map, which was wrong, and were never legally severed from the manor, and they are farmed today by a tenant of the Pelham estate, who has no better title to them than I have to the moon. I have known this since 1871, and I have done nothing about it, because to raise it in my lifetime would have been to hand 91 acres to my sons, who would have sold them within the year, and because I am a coward about lawyers. You will need it. When they come for the house, and they will come, you will need something they cannot argue with, and this is it, not because 91 acres will make you rich, though it will make you comfortable, but because a person who is fighting for her own property fights differently from a person who is defending a gift. Take it to Sowerby. He is dull, but he is honest, which in a solicitor is the correct order of priorities. One thing more, and then I have finished. When they say in the village that you took advantage of an old woman, do not answer them. Do not explain. It will be very hard, and you will want to, and it will do you no good at all, because the only answer to that accusation is the house itself, standing up, 10 years from now, with its roof on. Let the house answer. I have been very glad of you. That is a poor thing to be able to say to somebody after 11 years, and it is the truest thing in this letter. Augusta Harrowgate. Prudence Attwell walked to Shrewsbury. She could not afford the carrier, and there was no horse to spare that Ballard would let out, and she walked 17 miles with the 1799 estate map and a linen sleeve under her arm and the letter in her pocket, and arrived at Mr. Sowerby's office at 4 in the afternoon with her boots ruined. Mr. Sowerby was, as the old lady had said, dull and honest. He looked at the map and at the 1856 conveyance and at the tithe map, and then he sat back in his chair and took his spectacles off for the second time in 5 months and put to her, in a voice that had gone rather thin, how long she had known about this. Since March of last year. And why in God's name had she not mentioned it? Because she had promised the old lady she would not, and because the old lady had left her a letter in a cellar saying that she might. Mr. Sowerby put his spectacles back on and looked at her for some time, and then came the observation that turned the whole case, that in 11 years of practice he had never met a better answer to a plea of undue influence, because a woman who had spent 4 months in poverty rather than break a promise to a dead employer was not, on any reading, a woman who had manipulated her. The caveat did not survive the summer. It did not need a trial, it needed one afternoon in Mr. Sowerby's office, in which the son's solicitors were shown the letter in the old lady's own hand, dated 11 months before her death, laying out her reasoning in terms that no court in England was going to characterize as the product of a servant's influence, along with the discovery that the estate their clients were suing for was 91 acres larger than anybody had thought, and that establishing title to those acres would require the cooperation of the defendant they were attempting to ruin. Reginald Harrowgate withdrew. Clement held out for 6 weeks, and then withdrew too. Neither of them ever set foot in the house again. The 91 acres took 2 more years and were settled in the end without a trial. The Pelham estate's own lawyers, having examined the 1799 map and the manorial rolls, and advised their client, in the way lawyers do when the news is bad, that the matter was not one on which litigation could be recommended. Prudence Attwell did not get the land back. She got something better and less dramatic, a compromise, registered at Shrewsbury, under which the acres remained with the tenant who farmed them, and a rent charge of £112 a year in perpetuity was settled on the Manor of Harrowgate. £112 a year does not sound like a fortune, and it was not one. What it was the thing no Harrowgate had possessed since 1848, an income that did not depend on selling something. And Prudence Attwell, who had been in service since she was 13 and had never in her life had more than £11 at once, understood the difference better than any of them ever had. She did what the letter told her to do, which was nothing, loudly. She did not answer the village. She did not explain herself to her sister, or to the rector, or to the 2 Shrewsbury newspapers that wrote about the case, one of them unkindly. She put the money into the roof. The roof took 4 years, and the chimneys another one, and the damp in the north wing another 2 after that, and she did the whole of it in the order that a person who has cleaned a house learns rather than the order a person who owns one imagines. Water first, then heat, then floors, then the things that can be seen. Ballard stayed until he died in 1889 and was buried at her expense with the old lady's name on the same page of the register. She took on a girl from the village in 1883, the first person who would come, and then 2 more the following year when it became clear that Harrowgate paid on Fridays and did not shout, and by 1890 there were 9 of them and a waiting list, which in a parish where the 2 big estates paid quarterly and in arrears was a small revolution. And the house came back. Not grandly. Harrowgate was never a grand house, and Prudence Attwell never pretended it was. But by 1892, the plain oak furniture from 1811 was up out of the north cellar and back in the rooms it had been made for. And the long parlour where the will had been read had a fire in it every day, and the estate map of 1799 hung framed in the hall where anyone could look at it, and the roof, which was the whole of the argument, did not leak anywhere at all. The village came round the way villages do, which is slowly and then all at once, and without ever admitting that anything had happened. It came round when Harrowgate took the parish's boys on at harvest. It came round when Prudence lent the long parlour for the school treat in 1887 and stood at the back of her own room with her hands folded, out of habit, until a farmer's wife made her sit down. It came round completely in the wet autumn of 1891 when the Cleobury brook came up and took the bottom of the village, and the woman they had spent 11 years calling Sly opened 40 rooms to 11 families for 9 days, and fed them out of her own kitchen and never once, then or afterwards, mentioned it. She was 59 when a young man from the County Archaeological Society came to photograph the house and asked her, over tea, what it had been like to inherit a manor out of nowhere. And Prudence Attwell put him right. She had not inherited it out of nowhere. She had inherited it from a woman who had thought about it for a year, who had known exactly what it would cost her, and who had left her a letter in a cellar explaining precisely why, and that the hardest thing about the whole business had not been the lawyers or the village, but the 4 months in which she had kept a promise that would have been easier to break. She left Harrowgate to the parish in 1921 with the rent charge, on the single condition that the estate map of 1799 was to remain in the hall. The story of Harrowgate is a reminder that the most valuable thing an old woman can leave is not always a house, and that what looks from the outside like a servant's astonishing luck is very often somebody's long, deliberate, unsentimental judgment about who will actually take care of a thing. Augusta Harrowgate did not reward her maid. She chose a successor, the way a farmer chooses, and then she armed her, and then she told her to keep quiet and let the roof do the arguing. We hope Prudence's story has brought you a measure of peace this evening. If it moved you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, for there are many more tales of Hidden Worth waiting here, and let us know in the comments, has anyone ever seen something in you that the people around you could not? We will be back soon with the story of a squire, a manor nobody wanted, and a thing his own father sealed inside its walls. Until then, be well.